If you're interested in web accessibility, building a personal website is a great way to get practical experience. You don't need to use frameworks or content management systems. Using semantic HTML, CSS, and a little JavaScript, we can address some web accessibility fundamentals. I've recently made my own simple site and learned a lot. In this video, I share what I learned about using GitHub pages to host a site, landmarks, and their benefits for those who use screen readers, making a hamburger menu accessible through using accessible rich internet application attributes or ARIA, scroll to top buttons, and the importance of accounting for those who prefer reduced emotion, creating light and dark themes that accounts for operating system preference and also allows viewers to toggle between them, how I attempted to future-proof color choices by accounting for the accessible perceptual contrast algorithm APCA, which will be used in the next generation of the web content accessibility guidelines, and how to use JavaScript to change ARIA attributes. I'll be referring to the web content accessibility guidelines, using worked examples, and giving demonstrations using the NVDA screen reader.
Main menu button collapsed submenu. Expanded.
I'll also share what I learned on the way about performance and discoverability. I'm still learning. No doubt there are mistakes or errors, so let me know in the comments. This video has captions. On my website, you can find all the links I refer to and a full hyperlink transcript. Originally, I gave this presentation as part of a show and tell for my colleagues, and I've edited the presentation to share here on YouTube. Alright, let's get started. Hi everyone, today we're going to consider the impact that high quality markup can have on accessibility, performance, and discoverability. This is based on my real world experiences from building a personal site. So here's a brief list of what I'm going to cover and give practical examples of. Now I chose GitHub Pages because the URL you get has some credibility even though it's free. The site is really fast due to their content delivery network. My workflow was really simple. I just prepare files in Notepad, save them in a shared directory so I could access them from different devices, and GitHub has a desktop app that will publish the pages online. Really just like the old days, but you're not using FTP, you're using the GitHub desktop app. So what did I learn? Let's start with layout. It's a typical responsive layout. I've used colors here to make the different sections a bit clearer for you. And responsiveness brings to mind this important web content accessibility criterion. Reflow is expected now, and we're responsible for ensuring that our services at the University of Southampton deliver this basic requirement. The brilliant Una Kravitz has a wonderful video on YouTube showing 10 modern layouts in a line of CSS. So let's consider one way that high quality semantic markup impacts accessibility. We can use semantic HTML to declare landmarks for different parts of a page. So we could say this is the header and footer, this is the navigation, this is the main content and a defined article within it. This is the sidebar tagged as an aside, and in my case I've broken it down into sections. It's easy to forget what we lose if we cannot view a site. We miss having that at-a-glance view of the structure and nature of the content. And using a screen reader, we can navigate between these landmarks as long as they've been declared, either with semantic HTML or using ARIA roles. And this can help a screen reader user to get a feel for the structure of a page and to move quickly between landmarks. Course page on Blackboard, for example, has 3 navigational landmarks to traverse before you get to the content. Using the NVDA screen reader, the header is declared the banner landmark. Navigation is navigation landmark, and the main section is main landmark. The aside or sidebar is the complementary landmark, and the footer is the content info landmark. The success criterion info and relationships is intended to ensure that information and relationships that are applied by visual or auditory formatting are preserved when the presentation format changes. Using landmarks to identify regions on a page is one of the sufficient techniques for meeting this criterion. The Accessibility Insights browser plugin has a tool that reveals how landmarks are used on a page. Why not try it out on the sites you maintain, use, or support? Now, 36% of you said you use simplified views or reader modes. Using semantic landmarks is an effective way to ensure that the content that should be shown is identified. To conclude our look at layout, reflow is an obvious requirement, and the use of landmarks has many benefits, particularly for screen reader users and reader modes. On to navigation. Now, I followed this guide from W3 Schools on implementing a responsive navigation menu. Now, my site is really basic and simple. There's only 5 links in the menu, and on a smaller screen, a hamburger button is used to reveal the menu. Using the method was a good way to identify what was missing. In this video, I test it with a screen reader. Now, listen carefully to what the screen reader announces and pay attention to the focus order. Let's take a look.
Menu, menu button, submenu.
So I've selected the button, but how would a screen reader know that anything has actually happened? And look, the focus has moved to the browser controls instead of the next menu item.
Tab bar, tab control, tab actions, nav demo, new tab bar, app bar, toolbar, address, zoom, add this in private, settings and more, nav demo document, home link.
So we saw that the hamburger menu, when it was activated, there was no confirmation that anything had changed. And when we tabbed from the hamburger button, we had to tab through the browser controls until we got to the menu items. So here's the markup. I'd already done a little bit of tidying and made some initial improvements. The hamburger is a link with a role of button, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's definitely not best practice. Using a semantic button would be more appropriate. And it also appears at the end of the list, explaining why focus moves out of the navigation after the hamburger was selected. And the hamburger icon uses Font Awesome, which is a third-party font that's hosted externally. So let's review my updated implementation. I'll talk more about ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications, later, but I've given the navigation menu the semantic tag of nav and an ARIA label that screen reader users will hear. I've used a button instead of a link, and I've put that button at the beginning, so the following tab by the user in the browser will be to those menu items. And I've added ARIA properties to link it semantically to the navigation. And most importantly, I've given it an expanded ARIA attribute, so I can show whether the menu is expanded or not, and assistive technology, AT, will now understand that. When the hamburger is initially shown, we know that it will not be expanded, and we can change the attribute later with JavaScript. I got rid of Font Awesome and used an inline scalable vector graphic, or SVG, to represent the hamburger, and I made that hidden to screen reader users because the button itself has all the information they need. This is the initial JavaScript for the action that takes place when you press the button. Originally, it was to change a CSS class that would reveal the menu items. I've added a few lines in the same vein that would change the value of the ARIA expanded attribute from false, meaning it's collapsed, to true, meaning it is expanded. Now, this is really simple because I don't need to know what the original value was. I just assume that whenever the button is selected, we're going to toggle between one or the other. This then recalls the name, role, value, success criterion, which states that for all user interface components, the name and role can be identified by using a computer program. The aspects that a user can be changed by a computer program, and users of assistive technology are made aware of that change. The expanding, collapsing menu is a nice simple example of this in action, and I'll share another later. So let's revisit our example from the screen reader. Listen again carefully to the experience and observe the focus order.
Main menu, menu button, collapsed submenu. Expanded.
So screen reader knows that the menu's been expanded.
Collapsed.
And they know it's been collapsed.
Expanded. Home link.
And look, the focus has moved to the next menu item.
Presentations link. Blog posts link. Projects link. About link.
So that was a much improved experience, wasn't it? But it is quite a simple one, but maybe so simple you might not have thought of it before. Common mistake in accessibility is not testing the experience of components that only appear in mobile mode or when the screen is zoomed in. It's common across our sites at the University of Southampton to find hamburger design patterns that cannot be used with a keyboard. We must remember that impairments and disabilities can be intersectional. I may prefer to use a keyboard than a mouse or trackpad, and I might also prefer to zoom content in. Not everyone who uses a hamburger menu is going to be tapping a mobile phone. If you haven't heard of ARIA, or Accessible Rich Internet Applications, before, it's used to modify the accessibility tree that the browser creates and affects only assistive technology, or what we call AT. It's used to add extra information, express semantic relationships, and inform assistive technology of changes. This meme shows a full stack developer applying a massive bottle of olive oil labeled ARIA to a salad that is labeled Accessible Website. The first rule of ARIA is to use native elements where possible and only to use ARIA if you have to. So that hamburger button, that was a semantic button element, but we had to add an ARIA attribute to inform AT users of a menu collapsing or expanding. Now, a key thing for learning designers to be aware of is that ARIA brings numerous techniques for making interactive learning objects work well with AT, but they might not have been implemented in our authoring tools. So learning how to test for accessibility is important, as is building our understanding of what's possible so we can identify good practice. Now, it's fairly common to find scroll to top buttons on websites. Personally, I find them useful as I'm often reading lengthy web pages. The presentation support pages that I make also tend to have long lists of resources, so I added scroll to top and scroll to bottom on my site. This is another aspect that is frequently missed in terms of keyboard navigation. It's nice to use the scroll behavior setting to give a smooth scrolling experience, but we should give a chance to turn this off for our users if they have vestibular issues. And it's no use being keyboard navigable if the focus on the page is not also moved to the top of the page. And it's not just me saying this is clearly set out in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So here's my implementation. I'm using a button. I think it's debatable if it should be a link, but I see this as more performing an action. The button calls a function. We're going to look at that in a moment. And I'm using the recommended ARIA pattern for adding alternative text to an SVG. This is the function. It sets where the focus should land as well as scrolling to the top. And you have to set the focus to something that is interactive, so I've picked the skip link. The scroll behavior is set to smooth in CSS, and for those who have set to prefer reduced motion, the automatic behavior is set using this CSS media query. This is where users can choose to disable animations in Windows, and in Chrome, you can emulate this preference from the rendering options in DevTools. And if you're still not sure what I mean by differences in scroll behavior, I've made this video. Watch on the left the smooth scroll of a user who has not set a preference, in comparison with a user on the right who has turned off animations on their computer. The AAA success criterion, animations from interactions, requires us to allow users to prevent animations from being displayed on web pages. That's because some users find that fancy scroll effects like parallax or animations in general can cause nausea and migraines. More than 70 million people are affected by these vestibular disorders. Effects can include vertigo and hearing loss. Using the web when you have those experiences is going to be really tough, so that's what this success criterion is designed to accommodate. Reviewing a few University of Southampton sites, none meet all of the good practices that we've identified here. Why not go back and check your sites? So some final thoughts about navigation. We saw that small details like hamburgers and scroll to top buttons have accessibility considerations. And we saw that there are opportunities to respect user preference with animations. And we'll look a bit more about respecting user preference later on. And hopefully I showed the importance of really listening to and considering the screen reader experience. Next we're on to color. Just like Flow, providing a dark and light mode is expected on modern sites. And when I last checked the results, 40% of you prefer to use dark mode, 20% prefer light mode, and 40% will swap between themes based on your preference and circumstance. Now in Windows we can set what color scheme we prefer, and in Chrome DevTools we can emulate that preference. Now there are many benefits to both modes. Dark mode has become popular because it can save energy on LED displays and has some accessibility benefits, but there's just as many benefits for light mode, and that's why it's important to provide users with a choice. Hopefully it should be well accepted now that a maximalist approach to contrast should be avoided in digital. There is such a thing as too much contrast when we're presenting information in digital formats. A typical way to respect color scheme preference is to use CSS media queries. For my site, I split the color information into two CSS files, one for dark and one for light, and added a media query to them. This meant that the browser is only going to load one of these two CSS files. Picking colors from the University of Southampton palette for dark mode, I settled on these: plain black for background, neutral 4 for text, Marine 6 for focus indicators and hover states, and Horizon 1 for links. Now, of course, all of these are at AAA levels of contrast. I used the university colors because I'm still building my understanding of color combinations that work well. You might be wondering, why have I got 3 shades of black? So I retained rich black for legacy reasons because I'd used that in previous PowerPoint templates. templates, and I also added a non-university black. It was a 10% tint from the university color plain black. I used that to add some borders to the site when it's over a certain width on screen. I noticed this is a common practice on many sites, and it helps to make content a bit more readable on larger screens. At the moment, I've set it to a 10% margin. There's probably a better method here, so do let me know if you have any suggestions. In light mode, I had a bit less flexibility from the university palette. I wasn't able to use as many colors as I would have wanted to, and I also wanted to have a more creamy white than pure white, and the new university corporate PowerPoint templates have this kind of dull grey white, but I wasn't very keen on that. I wanted a more creamy one, and I had two shades of white because I was using those, that's for margins. So in light mode, I chose rich black with an ivory creamy white. Research presented in 2012 found that this combination was almost equally preferred by dyslexic readers and those without dyslexia. It also had low fixation durations for each group. Shorter fixations are preferred to longer ones. People who tend to make fewer eye fixations during reading usually have a higher reading pace than people who make more frequent fixations. Using SVG favicons, you can set them to have different color schemes dependent on theme choice by adding CSS styles within the SVG. And here are examples from my personal site of clear WCAG 2.2 compliant focus indicators in dark mode. Here you can see focus indicators for an unselected button on the left, a selected button on the right, and on the left we have two links, and on the right one of those links has been selected. And you can see the same approach in light mode. One of the reasons designers may remove focus indicators is that users see them when they use a mouse or touchpad to click on links, and I use this CSS to apply a different style for mouse clicks. You might be able to see here a little drop shadow added around the link and no outline. In WCAG 2.2, which is expected to be finalized soon, to reach the AAA success criterion for focus indicators, we need at least a 2 CSS pixel border, a contrast of 4.5 to 1 or higher, and the focus to not be hidden by author-created content. Now, it wouldn't be an accessibility presentation without talking about contrast. In WCAG 2.1 and 2.2, we're used to thinking in terms of contrast ratios, but in WCAG 3, which is probably a few years down the line, that uses this new accessible perceptual contrast algorithm. It's still in development. It's going to be a very big change. It's much more sophisticated than previous measure of contrast and is more accurate, and it produces a lightness contrast rating. The higher, the better. We will find that some combinations that met WCAG 2 will fail under this new APCA measurement, and you can see two examples here from the university color palette. For this site, I decided to future-proof by ensuring colors I chose would meet both WCAG 2 and APCA. Chrome DevTools can be configured to measure for APCA, and you can use the CSS overview in DevTools to find all failing examples. I found that using this in combination with the color matrix script I'd written was really useful for identifying which colors would and wouldn't work. So in dark mode, the body text is above 90 LC, and the same in light mode. Now, I do find that when you're in light mode, you are going to get higher contrast ratings under APCA. It's good practice not to make design decisions based on presumptions. Some may not know how to change the color scheme at operating system level, and just might not be aware it's possible. And some might not like an implementation of dark or light theme that you've decided upon on your site. So it's good to give people a choice. I'd already put a light bulb icon at the top left of my site to represent ideas and thinking, and it looked like a good fit for putting in as a color theme toggle. So the idea is it's going to set a preference using low storage. I'm using the user interface pattern of an on-off button, mainly because at home I have dimmer switches and you push them in to turn them on, and you push it in so it goes out again to turn it off. So I settled on using ARIA press. The changes need to be announced to the screen reader, and we need to use more than just color alone to represent the difference. So in dark mode, the light is on, and you can tell because those little lines are coming out around the bulb. This was an interesting challenge with me. I'm going to talk you through the details. Now, this is my implementation. If you spot any issues or have suggestions on how to make it better, please do let me know in the comments. So here's the button. When it loads, it's set to not pressed. So when the web page loads, button is ARIA state is set to not pressed. That's only going to be the correct state if you're in light mode. I also have a span here with an ARIA live attribute that I will populate to announce changes. So I needed to do 3 things. First, set whether the button was actually pressed or not, depending on whether it was in light or dark mode. Then when changing themes, the preference had to be saved, change announced to the screen reader, and the value of the pressed attribute to be changed. If a preference had been saved, then we need to load the desired theme when the page is loaded, instead of that preferred at operating system level. I broke it down into these 3 parts because it helped me to make a solution piece by piece. This part is setting whether the button is pressed or not on page load, and it depends on what theme is being used. DT is the operating system preference, and theme pref is the site specific preference if there is one. So if the operating system preference is dark and the local site preference is dark, then the button is pressed. Likewise, if the operating system preference is light but the local site preference is dark, then that means the user wants dark mode, the button is going to be pressed. And if the operating system preference is dark and there's no local site preference, then the button is pressed again. And in all other cases, we're going to be in light mode, the button is not going to be pressed. Once we press that button, we wanted to change themes, change the value of ARIA pressed, and save the preference. This is the function that is performed when the light bulb icon is selected. Now it's based on a choice. If at the beginning the button was pressed, that means it was in dark mode, so the user wants to change to light mode. So we're going to change ARIA pressed to not pressed, change the CSS loaded in the head to be the light CSS colors. Now I appreciate this is a bit of a hack. We're going to set the choice in local storage and add a notification to screen reader users. If the button was not pressed at the beginning, meaning we're in light mode, then the user wants to go into dark mode, and the rest of the function is going to do the opposite, but I'm not going to show you it here because it's the same thing that we saw above, but everything's just swapped around. This is the hidden text for screen reader users. I've added a CSS class that's going to hide it from view, and it's an ARIA live region. So the text that's created by the function we saw in the previous slide is going to be squirted into that span tag and then announced to the screen reader. Final piece is respecting the choice of themes. And it checks if there is a preference from the user. So have they pressed the button and it saved their preference? And if so, then when they go to other pages on the site, we need to make sure that preference is respected. Here we check if there is that local preference, we set the theme accordingly and set the state of the button. So let's hear and see how this works from the screen reader's perspective.
Welcome document. Visited link skip to content. Banner landmark change between light and dark theme toggle button not pressed. Dark theme enabled, the button is now pressed.
Now you might be thinking, hang on Matt, do we really need to make this compatible with screen readers, changing between light and dark mode, because they're not going to see it, right? Well, remember what we said about intersectionality. Not everyone who uses a screen reader is blind, and there are different levels of sight that people might have, and who are we to say what functionality anyone can and can't use on our site? Perhaps the screen reader user is navigating our page using the screen reader, but they have others among them, perhaps members of the family, who prefer a different mode, and so the screen reader user is changing the theme on the page. We don't know what people are going to be using on our website, and accessibility is about removing barriers to using our services and sites for everyone. And we're reminded of that basic success criterion about names and roles, states and properties, and notification of changes. So let's take a look at performance. Now my site was really simple. There's no excuse for it not to be performant, but here's what I learned that I think you might be useful for me to share with you. Now I used the W3C validator to test for conformant HTML. Now I also used the webpagetest.org website to run performance tests on my pages as I built them. And out of curiosity, I had a look at a few other services at the University of Southampton that are well known for our audience. So one of the options on webpagetest.org is that you can test from different locations on different devices, and here is a set of tests that were run on a 3G connected mobile in Mumbai. So if the experience is good in Mumbai on a 3G phone, then it's probably going to be good everywhere. Now I'm going to give you a quick review of what these features are about. First byte is how long it takes from requesting the page to getting the first byte of data. The start render marks the moment when a web page displays the first asset. The first contentful paint, FCP, is when the browser renders the first bit of content, providing that first feedback to the user that the page is actually loading. Speed index, SI, is how quickly the contents of a page are visibly populated. LCP stands for largest contentful paint and tracks the time it takes for the largest visual part of the page to load. It's a measure of how long it takes for a user to actually start working with our site. TBT is total blocking time. TBT is the total time between the first contentful paint and time to interactive. And total bytes is the amount of data downloaded. When you pay for your data, you don't want to be paying for things that aren't going to be giving you value. Now, from a sustainability point of view, it's worth paying attention to how much content is downloaded to users. Some might be on a metered connection. And the reason why this number is so high on this site, the Digital Learning blog, is that there's an auto-playing YouTube video at the beginning. So we've already downloaded 12 megabytes in the time that web page test has initiated and completed testing of that page. Quite a lot of data, particularly if you're paying for it byte by byte. This service also allows us to see which parts are being loaded on the page and how long each individual part takes. So render blocking resources, marked here with an X icon, are things that block or delay the browser from rendering page content to the screen. So do we really need the H5P plugin on every page? Do we need to use Font Awesome and Google Fonts? Google Fonts is being loaded from googleapis.com, which is a GDPR risk. Now, this might all be legitimate, but has anyone actually sat down and thought about this before? Chrome has a feature called Lighthouse. It's this brilliant article which explains how you can trick the results of Google Lighthouse, but still, it is worth using. You get ratings for performance, accessibility, best practice, and SEO. My site is very simple, so getting 100 isn't special, but it did make me want to look at the scores for other sites. I expect that our corporate communications team will be monitoring regularly the Lighthouse scores for the corporate site because it's so important. This is the page that new people who want to find out about the university are going to be accessing. So it needs to be performant, accessible, follow best practices, and have great search engine optimization. And this is our e-learning support resources. It's soon going to be replaced with a new version. So we definitely want to be monitoring performance, and we can definitely do better than 58 for performance, can't we? And in fact, all of our WordPress sites have terrible scores for performance. The Digital Learning blog has only got 54. I'm going to take us a little sidetrack now to talk about accessibility of the Digital Learning blog. The thing about WordPress sites is quite often once you've picked a theme, you're kind of locked in to the accessibility that that theme provides, and it can be quite hard to make improvements without changing the whole theme. So Tamsin Smith and I looked into this. There was lots we couldn't fix. There's still a hamburger button that cannot be used with the keyboard, but we were able to use the additional CSS option in WordPress to make a lot of changes. In fact, 325 lines is what we did in total. Let's take a look at a few examples. We've got before on the left and after on the right. So this is the masthead, which you can see on the left, its before state was pretty much unreadable. This was fixed by adding background color with a little opacity and changing the text color. And that footer is also pretty terrible on the left, isn't it? We're able to fix that and also remove a few details that just weren't needed. My favorite, the mega menu along the top, and obviously no one had ever tested it with a keyboard before because, as you can see, the menu items appear behind the content on the left, the before state. On the right, there you can see that a change to the Z index brought the menu on top. We've made numerous other improvements to the menu since then, but that was definitely the biggest. What did I do on my site? Well, I used Tiny PNG and Tiny JPEG to optimize image size, and I added lazy loading on images and YouTube embeds so that they would only be loaded up once you'd got to that point on the page. Where I had used extra scripts like jQuery, I only loaded those on the pages where they were actually going to be used, because it's only on about 2 of the pages that I'm actually using any jQuery. And I reduced critical chaining requests by using media queries for the light and dark CSS files in the head of the page. So to summarize, we just need to be using some of these free management tools to get an understanding of whether users will find our site slow or fast. There's a little bit of automated accessibility checking, and This isn't talking about load testing or anything like that. This is simple tests that we can do, and if we find any issues, then we need to be talking to the site managers to find out what is the justification for poor performance. Why are our WordPress sites so terrible at performance? So in terms of discoverability, on my site I added a sitemap, registered the site on Google search, and I added an RSS feed. I could still add a local search and breadcrumb navigation, but this is a very simple site. Right now there's only 34 pages, but I'll try and get to adding a few more of those later. Now let's put the in meta. Let's look at some meta tags. So here you can see I've added some open graph tags and Twitter card tags. Now it's expected now that when we share a link on Teams, Twitter, LinkedIn and so on, that we're going to get a nice preview. And it can also help to build awareness of our site and establish credibility. We want people to share our content and we want it to look good wherever it appears. Now, there are validators online that you can use to help check how the previews will look. Now, it's great to see it happening. Here is accessibility legend Alistair McNaught sharing one of my pages on Twitter, and on the right is a connection request on LinkedIn from someone who found me through my personal site. So I recommend using card validators to fine-tune how your links will look. In terms of what's next, I would like to move the build process into a static site generator like Eleventy. That will make updating the site template much more efficient. And I would like to hide video embeds behind a click-to-load pattern, both for privacy and performance reasons. The traditional approach to dark mode is to use CSS variables, then build classes around them and swap them with JavaScript. So if I ever find the time to look at that and refactor, then I'm definitely want to do that because I haven't used CSS variables before and it looks really powerful. And as I think of more things that I want to share on the site, I'll be building up that component library that I've started on, different design patterns. Like soon I want to do a responsive table pattern with appropriate ARIA where necessary and light dark color schemes. And I've got lots of accessibility related projects I have in mind that I want to build, and now I've got a platform to build them on. So in a way the hard work is done and the fun begins. So in this presentation I really wanted to share my struggles to deepen my understanding of accessibility and to be able to share with you some concrete examples and what my approach was to solving them. I hope that has helped. I also know that I'm still learning and there's probably some mistakes in there, so if I've got anything wrong or you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know in the comments. We've reached the end of the video. Remember, everything I refer to is listed on this webpage. The transcript also has handy hyperlinks to these resources. The code snippets were created using Prism.js and styled using Ally syntax highlighting CSS by Eric Bailey. A big thank you to Eric for making that, and also for his articles about vestibular issues and the preferred reduced motion media query, which I quoted from earlier in this presentation. You can download the slide deck and other resources at this link and visit my site for other presentations. Thanks for watching. Let me know your feedback, good or bad. See you in the next one.